Turn with me in your copy of God's Word to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Christian realism recognizes some basic truths that are reflected in this text. Some of life is mundane. It's just not exciting. Does not snap, crackle, pop. Does not dazzle. Just the same old, day after day. And some of life is just common sense. Living in the real world sometimes just means using our common sense. Yet, so many don't. And all of life requires wisdom. And we need it not just for the big things, the major decisions, but we need wisdom for the inconsequential, the small things. But we will learn something here that is necessary for us and that we must weigh carefully. And Solomon here will teach us that a little folly can ruin even great wisdom. Now, this text defies all organization, which was driving me crazy. You know I'm an organized person, usually. It's not really Hebraic in its structure, nor will it sort of easily organize by category. Commentators are just pulling their hair out. And maybe that's the point. Given the fact that even a little folly can spoil great wisdom, maybe we need to recognize that we too often are trying to organize our life into manageable bits and categories. God allows enough chaos to overturn our dependence on our own wisdom and organizational structures and administrative abilities. You cannot make the Garden of Eden out of a field of thorns and thistles and painful childbirths. For life is not clean, it's not ordered, it isn't truly manageable. Now, that does not mean that we do not try, that we simply go with whatever flow happens to grab us at the moment. But the fallenness, the disorder, the slow decay of our world can only be totally reversed by a new creation. And so, we are then living between Eden and eternity. And as a people who do so, we do so with wisdom, and we do so with a sense of realism. Now, Solomon opens this with an illustration that is meant to set the stage and sort of hold our attention. This sets the stage for his observation, the different kinds of character and conduct, and the warnings that are attached to them. Solomon chapter 9, verse 13 begins this way. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it really seemed great to me. There was a little city with a few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, and though the poor man's wisdom be despised, and his words are not heard. For the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. But one sinner destroys much good. Notice that he opens with a saving axe in verses 13 through 15. By his wisdom, a poor but wise man once saved his town. A powerful king's army had surrounded it. They had laid siege to his town with great effort and expense. And though, curiously, we do not know how, he was able, through his wisdom, to save the town. But then there's the sad reality. His great achievements were soon forgotten. Even of the telling it in this text, how he did it is not related. It's not remembered. And so no one, sadly, commemorated what he had done. Why was that? He was not remembered because he was poor. The poor are often forgotten in their achievements. This is a sad reality of the world in which we often live. But there is an interesting conclusion then that we should, along with Solomon, draw from this. Wisdom is still better than strength. Strength or power may still overcome, but it is better to achieve through the wise use of means than by brute force or strength. Even if the world is deaf to the wisdom or scoffs at the wisdom, still speak it and still live by it. In the real world, many gain attention and win the day with shouting. But so often their words and ways are full of folly. The wisdom that reflects God's thinking is often quiet and peaceful and full of meekness. Of this, the New Testament reminds us in James chapter 3, verses 17 and 18, where James writes, starting in verse 16, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be chaos, disorder in every vile practice, but the from above wisdom is first pure and peaceable and gentle and open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits. It's impartial and sincere. And the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the quiet wisdom of the poor and lowly brings defeat to the powerful and the mighty. And Jesus came as poor and lowly, as despised and rejected, and yet full of from above wisdom. And he confounded the wise and the religious. He defeated our enemy. But Jesus will not be forgotten. He will be greatly prized and ever so much praised. And then in this world in which we are thinking about between Eden and eternity, we're thinking about risks and dangers, we're thinking about a little folly ruining great wisdom. Notice some incongruities. There's some unexpected ironies. Now listen, if you're not a person who can chuckle and actually at times have a deep sense of satisfaction and at ironies, you're going to struggle in this world. God is a God of humor. God is a God of irony. And occasionally Jesus spoke, and the New Testament author spoke, with a sense of godly sarcasm. And we see him pointing to a series of, just unexpected things that happen. Solomon points out some that set our minds thinking about them, We live in a fallen world, and so many things work well, and most things will break. Verse 1, there's an unexpected incongruity and a little folly. Verse 1, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Now, this actually could be the overall theme of this text. It's an unexpected unsuitableness. It's ironic. Dead flies do not belong in perfume, but their stench will overwhelm even the good fragrance. And by the way, you're not to think of the little flies that buzz around us, little fruit flies. You are to think of Middle Eastern horse flies, which as they're flying, And in the same way, a little folly can ruin wisdom and honor. And this is not what we would expect. We think that wisdom will overcome, or even a little wisdom will overcome great folly. That's not what Solomon observes. In this world, between Eden and eternity, when you mix folly and wisdom, you get a stench. And so Solomon says, so think about that. And then he moves on to a heart's inclination in verse 2, where he writes, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. The NLT renders this, a wise man chooses the right road, and a fool chooses the wrong one. Now, you got to be careful. In the current political climate, it's easy to read this verse with a sort of knowing chuckle. That's not the sense here. In fact, there's quite a bit of a discussion about what this means. The language itself is about an inclination of the heart. The fool has a disposition of the heart. His heart is inclined to something, while the wise person is inclined to something else. And this is described as a left hand versus a right hand. Now, many commentators and translations think like the NLT. And others think that the reference is to turning down a wrong road versus the right road. The heart of a fool is usually inclined to the wrong road, and the heart of the wise is usually inclined to choose the right road. And in this case, the left hand is being associated with what is wrong, and the right hand with what is right. And you have to think, is this really are we reading this as Westerners? Another view is quite different and relies on understanding some background. It has to do with cultural customs, particularly in the Middle East. The left hand was associated with bodily functions, the right hand with eating and writing. So the inclinations here are not on some political or economic or even geographic continuum. The fool's heart moves toward the wrong road, or toward the dirty, the dark, the dung. And the wise heart moves toward the right road, what sustains and strengthens and lifts up lives. An inclination of the heart of the fool toward that which is dark and wrong, rather than an inclination of the wise toward that which is right and uplifting. And then, sort of keying off the word road, verse 3, we have an unavoidable exposure. I love this one. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he's a fool. Now, contrary to our roads, a road back then was actually designed to be a safe place to walk. A fool walking down the middle of 741 would be manifestly a fool in our culture because, he won't walk for long. But in their culture, there may be horses and carriages, but most of the traffic is going to be people on foot. But because he lacks sense, the way the fool walks on the road, even then exposes him as a fool. There is an unexpected ineptness, means that this fool is never safe. from exposing his folly. Fools eventually show themselves to be foolish. And then in this world there is a surprising strategy. Verse 4. If the anger of the ruler, the leader, the boss, rises against you, don't leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Now, in a good way, our natural tendency is to flee from dangers, and sometimes the tendency, when faced with the anger of the authority, is to try to placate that anger. And both reveal fear and desperation. In the real world, fear and desperation tend to draw out the pursue and destroy reflex in the powerful. Solomon says, do not allow provocations to drive you into rash responses. You've seen the t-shirt, right? Be calm. I want one that says, be calm. God is in control. Don't quit. Don't leave your place. Respond with meekness and calmness. What underlies this sense of calmness in the face of trouble is trust in God. 1 Peter 3, 1-6 commends this to wives. Here Solomon reminds us of this surprising strategy. Be calm, don't quit, don't be provoked, respond in meekness. But then in our world we often find ironic and unacceptable reversals, verses 5-7. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, verse 5. As it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in the low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Once again, so much of this is not our world. That we read this and we're just wrestling with the imagery. But these verses indicate that some reversals of fortune are not desirable. No, in fact, they are evil and will bring evil. Through a series of situations, Solomon points us to the fact that sometimes the elevation of the lowly, of the unworthy, of the unqualified, particularly when done by an authority, results in evil consequence. So the elevation of folly and the unsuitable reversal of roles soon will lead to ever more evil. This is exacerbated when the elevation or the reversal is done or is exercised by the one in authority. It doesn't take much for bad leaders to ruin even a good church, a good business, even a good nation. Because Solomon is king, many of these observations are in the realm of politics. It's the world in which he was very familiar. He has seen so much, even in his world, of the folly that we associate with Western politics, even our own. It's changed little from the days of Solomon to our days. As Christian realists, we recognize the corrupting power of political power. We generally observe that there is a perverse kind of crafty wisdom that soon becomes folly. May be inclined to regularly choose the wrong road or choose the dirty or the dark or the depraved. And certainly, we often observe that leaders and politicians, and sometimes even good ones, make foolish choices. And so this is the world in which we live. It is the world that which we are often trying to correct and reverse through means sometimes that are not authorized by the Scriptures. It is a world in which we as Christians need to live with enormous godly wisdom. And so, in this world then, Solomon moves on to talk generally about dangers that are faced by workers, verses 8-11. Where a little folly can spoil great wisdom, Solomon offers warnings to those who labor in the world. Here is where common sense meets common situations and warns of dangers. I'm still sort of mentally waiting for the translation. I've been preaching for 4 weeks with someone saying something after I do. And so here first he warns them to beware in their relationships. Verse 8, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. You know, this is some of these things are just common sense. They're like the proverb. I refer to this proverb a lot because it makes me smile. You know, there's a proverb in Proverbs that actually says, if you punch someone in the nose will bleed. Well, duh. I mean, I need a biblical proverb to tell me that? No, what the Bible is telling us, that so much of wise living is, at the end of the day, just, it's common sense. Well, this is an old and useful warning. If you dig a pit or a trap for others, by the way, this is not a well, which is what seems to be related in some translations. This is a trap. You're digging a pit so someone else can fall into it. If you dig a pit or a trap for others, watch out. You may fall into it. We've all heard this, and it is so true. God has built a sense of poetic justice into the world, and too many fall into the very things they were going to use to harm someone else. And secondly, if you demolish an old established boundary or wall, beware lest a snake bite you. Now, if can you hear an allusion back to the Garden of Eden? If you get out of bounds, there may be something waiting for you there. These walls, these boundaries have a good reason to exist. Now, in the common nature of things, snakes hide in shadows or bask in stones. And trouble will come if you disturb what is best left standing. So there's just the common sense warning. Be careful if you're going to tear down an old wall. There may be a snake hiding in there. But there may be more involved here. Be careful. When you start trying to remove good and appropriate boundaries that have stood the test of time, because evil may be lurking there and may bite you. Beware in your relationships. Then he goes on to say, beware in your work, verse 9. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. See, there are many dangers that are attendant to our vocation. Here's just common sense. So many people go to their work and are oblivious of the dangers that surround them. 2 different kinds of work are being addressed. There are those who are working in what we would think of as heavy industry, represented in their day by quarrying. Working in a quarry, take caution lest the stones crush you. The very nature of the work exposes the worker to the danger. And on the opposite side of the scale is the casual work done by most men of the day in their backyards and around their house. This is illustrated by splitting logs for firewood. So the home worker then is warned to take caution against accidents happening. Now, I know that, we can look at this and say, well, I don't know that I need a sermon, or I need 2 verses in the Bible to tell me about this. But a lot of folks don't live in the real world. I mean, they live in the real world, but they're kind of oblivious to it. And so they act as though the dangers attendant to their work on their job or their work around the house are in some way not meaningful, they're not really dangers. The theme here is that if we are to live wisely in the fallen world, we must recognize that accidents happen. No one is invulnerable. We live in a fallen world. Accidents and dangers and harm are a part of it. We cannot live in this world under the sun without a certain amount of risk. And so, verse 10, beware of your tools. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. Now, not many of us are familiar with chopping wood. The warning here is to beware lest the dull axe strike you. A sharp axe may be more deadly, but it is in fact less risky. A dull axe tends to bounce off or to skate off the surface, and a wise worker will keep his tools in good shape and in good condition. Now, many of our tools for work are technology-based. The principle still holds true. You must maintain your equipment or it will become dangerous. It may eventually harm you and your work. You live in a real world in which things fail. And so you are responsible in wisdom to take care of things. Now, by inclination, if I may say this, we as Americans are sort of more inclined, more taught this. Not necessarily so in some places. Maintenance, question mark? And then verse 11 is one of those, just cool. Verse 11, watch your timing. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, you know there's no advantage to the charmer. This one is actually some biting sarcasm. If a snake bites before the charmer charms, then the charmer is dead. He failed to anticipate the timing and the danger. It's useless to deal with a problem that's already completed its damage. Yet people do it all the time. Anticipate the problem, deal with the issue. It is certainly no advantage to you if the problem bites you and destroys you. Well, from these warnings, then, we move to a description of a fool. And there's a sense here in which, well, this is the next subject, and it kind of makes sense. Because if you don't heed these warnings, you don't understand these incongruities, then you may, but you may be a fool. Listen to what he does. The fool's folly emerges into major aspects of life. First, in his words, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? See, the fool tends to three troubling tendencies in his talk. He tends toward talk that, instead of winning people to him, eventually turns people against him. May not start like that, but the tendency in fools is kind of talk that eventually develops enemies. And secondly, he tends toward talks that begins in foolishness and just ends up being irrational. It may not be full-blown gibbering madness, but it will certainly not be rational, not reasoning, and certainly not fitted to the world in which he speaks. And the fool tends toward talking more and more and more and more and saying less and less. Even though no one knows what will be in the future, the fool blathers on like he knows exactly what he's talking about and exactly how it will unfold, and eventually his talk leaves people wondering, what is he actually talking about? You want to see this in action today? Turn on your TV. Watch the foolish, self-consuming, irrational, unintelligible talk of some of today's progressives in economics and politics and the media. It's almost, just too easy. But not only in his words, but in his work. For the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. The talk of a fool consumes him. The work of the fool tires him. But don't we all become tired or even weary in our work? On the face of it, this text says that the fool gets so tired in his work that he has no strength to go home. But given the words that Solomon used, could there be more that is meant? See, See, Solomon often used language in Ecclesiastes that takes us back to the book of Genesis. We are reminded that we live in the real world, and the real world is not the Garden of Eden. The real world we live in is fallen and cursed. This is the place and time of toil. The work of the garden has become the toil in this present age. There will one day be a new creation in which our work will no longer be toiling in thorns and thistles. But now we toil. We use different words for it, but it is still, in the old Bible sense, it's a laborious toil. The fool's toils are wearisome because of the second phrase. The fool's toil is wearisome because he does not know the way home. He does not know the way to the city. He is stuck in the fields of his toils. In the larger arc of the Bible, the wise person toils, but is not wearied in the same way. The wise person knows the way home. We know the end. We know the way to the city of God. We are not stuck in the fields of our toil. We labor in these fields in the hope of a harvest later, in the hope and surety of the city that is to come. But then he turns to the nation's leaders. Once again, there is a sense of, well, if you're going to talk about fools, this might be your next subject. In the real world, we have to recognize the great effect poor leaders have on even a great nation. Verse 16, he writes, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Happy you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility, your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness." Now, once again, you can see a small amount of folly can ruin that which is great. Notice two things. One, what brings trouble, verse 16. Two problems in leaders will bring trouble to those under their authority. The first is immaturity. Now, this may be a cause of age or experience. In Solomon's day, children sometimes were kings, and others ruled through them as proxies. But the general principle is that immaturity in leaders will bring much trouble to those they lead. Immaturity is not a result of just being young. Immaturity is a result of a lack of experience, a lack of insight, a lack of discretion. Almost by definition, the immature will be fools. To be led or governed by people who are childish and self-focused, see life as a game and work as play, well, they'll bring many difficulties. And some of you have worked in situations like this. Many have watched amazingly immature adults that have been elected not once but over and over again. This is sad. This is the way it is in the world under the sun. And so we long for the day when the Ancient of Days in deep and solemn wisdom and eternal maturity will rule and reign over us in the new creation. But then notice what brings good. Verse 17, happy are you. This longing is hinted at the blessing what brings good. We are blessed when led by those whose background and education experience has prepared them for a wise and mature leadership. We know these kind of people because they have a serious and sober approach to life. And yes, they can feast and celebrate, but they do so at the right times, in the right ways, for the right purposes. They are not inclined to drunkenness. This is the kind of leadership that brings good and blessing, even in this hard place of sin and curse under the sun. But there will be a day when the noble Son of a heavenly Father will rule. He'll bring the good that we long for. We are then able to serve and submit well, for we know what an assured hope that it will come to pass. And we live now in the knowledge that our present blessedness and happiness are simply foretastes of that eternal blessedness and happiness that is yet to come. Well, Now we come to the close of this section. The unifying thread here seems to be in noting how we're thinking, our attitudes, our heart's attitudes in verses 18 to 20. Through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through indolence, the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. Now, in some ways, Solomon's warnings here are also commending their opposite. And so there is a hard attitude where there is apathy in needed work. Verse 18, sloth is an great old word. Here is the lazy, indolent person whose roof is leaking and now begins to sag. And remember that the roof in their day was not pitched as a rule like ours are. They were flat. In fact, they were often places where people lounged in the evenings. So apathy and laziness may seem to be little things, but the consequences can be huge. A little leak may not seem to be much, but it can lead to a fallen roof. And so we are called to diligence in the world where everything tends to fade and fail and fall. Nothing in this world lasts forever. Everything in this world will decay. So wise people who want to be pleasing to God apply themselves to maintaining what God has given them. If Solomon were here, I think he would say something like this: we do not live in a maintenance-free world. And then there is frivolity in the fallen world. Now the first two phrases here don't sound really negative. Till you get to the third one, then you realize the third one looks back on the first two and really is speaking of frivolity. The observation about the nature of life. It is a proverb, but it also carries with it a warning. Notice that life here is being reduced to laughter, to fun, to happiness. These things tend to bring these things. But if we think that bread and wine and money will satisfy in this world, then frankly we are frivolous and we are immature. We are like the people described in the context. We are called to joyful seriousness. Yes, we may and should be glad and joyful in the sharing of bread and wine. And boy, what does that remind us of? And yes, money is a necessary ingredient, and the world is designed by God. None of these things are ultimate. They are wonderful. We can enjoy them. But they are passing, and they are transitory. Even the bread and wine as symbols of our Lord's death and our union with Him and with each other will last in this world under the sun. And one day all these symbols of our redemption will be lifted up by the one who is their reality. And then the third attitude is rebellion in hidden words, verse 20. Verse 20 reflects a proverb, a saying that exists in many languages and cultures. In essence, he says, be careful what you say because you don't know who's listening. This is more than a warning about guarded thoughts and hidden words. This is a warning that rebellion against authority has a way of becoming public. Submission is hard in this world. It's so easy to whisper rebellious words in our hearts. It's easy to share rebellious words to others in secret places and secret ways. But rebellion, sin against God. Satan whispered in his own heart before he rose up in public rebellion against the high King of heaven. A lack of submission begins first in inner words of our heart, and it spreads through quiet words to others, but it is usually uncovered by God in the situations that He allows or brings. A lack of submission then often spreads like a small spark, ignites a forest fire, James reminds us. Be careful, be warned, be repentant. Now, gleaning through these verses, we can learn the character and conduct of four groups of people. There are those who are wise. Their hearts directs them to do what is right, toward the good and the uplifting. Their mouths give forth gracious words. And then there are those who are foolish. Their hearts direct them to do what is evil. The way they walk betrays them as fools, and they are often tragically given great authority. They are consumed by their own words, and sometimes they are exhausted by even the simplest tasks. And then he characterizes those in authority in our response to them. Stay calm and don't quit. If your boss is angry with you, woe to the land whose king, whose ruler, whose governor is a child, is immature. Happy is the land whose king is worthy, a nobleman. Don't make light of a king, even in your thoughts. Watch for every rising of rebellion. And those who are lazy, lets the roof leak and the rafters rot. Beloved, we must be realistic. We do not live in a perfect world with perfect people. This is true in the world. This is true in the church. Nowhere now is the Garden of Eden. The new creation has begun in us through the new birth, but we are still here in the old. This is a time under the sun where the old and the new overlap. For the glory of God and the good of each of us, be pleasing to God, be gracious to people, because a little folly will spoil the best. So live under the sun, between Eden and eternity. Live with wisdom. Let's pray. Father, we all want to impose even good and even godly order on our world. But it is a place in which you have placed us, you have designed, and you have ordered under a curse, under a fall. And so we need to learn to live here with great wisdom. This is what Ecclesiastes is teaching us. But we do not live here, Father, as though there is nothing else, as though this is all there is. We do know the way home. We do know the way to the great city. We do know the new creation is coming. We do know that there will be a day when the cup and the bread will be lifted by our true Lamb. And we do know that the new creation comes in which righteousness will dwell. Till then, teach us to live with wisdom. Amen.